On a night when the Montana cold turned breath to ice and the world disappeared beneath a wall of white, farmer Marcus Chen nearly drove past what would change everything. His headlights caught something in the drifts along Whitefish Pass, shapes that shouldn't exist in a place where nothing living could survive. 3 wild horses, chained and half buried in snow, their bodies trembling against death itself. He thought saving them would be an act of mercy, a small redemption for a man drowning in his own ghosts. But what unfolded in the weeks that followed would crack open wounds he thought sealed forever, force him to choose between safety and vulnerability, and prove that sometimes the creatures we rescue are actually rescuing us. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The blizzard had swallowed Iron Ridge whole, turning the valley into something prehistoric and unforgiving. Marcus Chen gripped the steering wheel of his old Ford pickup, the heater wheezing against windows that kept fogging no matter how many times he swiped them clear. The truck's headlights barely cut through the snow, 2 weak beams that died just feet ahead, swallowed by the endless white curtain that fell from a sky he couldn't even see anymore. Whitefish Pass Road twisted through the mountains like a scar, narrow and treacherous even in good weather. Tonight it was barely a suggestion beneath 3 feet of powder that kept building with each gust of wind that hammered the valley. He'd been in town longer than he'd planned. Morrison's feed and supply had been packed with ranchers stocking up before the storm hit full force, their voices carrying that particular edge people get when nature reminds them how small they really are. Maria Rodriguez had cornered him by the register, her eyes holding that mixture of concern and determination that made Marcus want to bolt for the door. She'd pressed a thermos of coffee into his hands, the kind of gesture that people in Iron Ridge offered instead of the words they knew wouldn't help. He'd mumbled something approximating gratitude and left before she could ask the questions that always hovered unspoken between them. How are you really doing? Are you eating? Do you need anything? The answers were always the same silence, because the truth was too heavy to hand someone in a feed store on a Thursday afternoon. The coffee sat in the cup holder now, long cold, as Marcus navigated the climb toward his property. The old riverside farm waited somewhere ahead in the dark, 40 acres of land he'd inherited from an uncle he barely remembered, a place he'd fled to 3 years ago when the walls of his life in Billings had finally collapsed inward. The farm had seemed like salvation then, distance measured in miles from the house that had burned, from the hospital where he'd held Sarah's hand as machines beeped their futile rhythms, from the funeral where he'd stood between 2 small coffins and felt his capacity for feeling anything crack clean through. He'd thought space and silence would be medicine. Instead, they'd become a different kind of prison, one with wider walls but no less confining. The engine groaned as the truck struggled against an incline, tires spinning briefly before catching. Marcus's hands ached from gripping the wheel, his shoulders tight with the constant tension of keeping the vehicle from sliding into the ditch that waited on either side of the road. He was thinking about the barn, about whether the roof would hold under the weight of all this snow, when he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind, that particular shriek it makes when it finds the right angle through pine branches. But then it came again, rising above the storm's constant roar, a sound that didn't belong to weather or trees. Something raw and desperate that cut through the cab of the truck like a knife through cloth. Marcus eased his foot off the gas, leaning forward as if those few inches would help him see through the wall of white. The sound came a third time, closer now, and with it came a physical sensation in his chest, a tightening he recognized from years of responding to emergency calls. That's a living thing, his paramedic brain informed him with clinical certainty. That's pain and fear and something dying if you don't do something about it. He pulled the truck to the side of the road, or what he hoped was the side, the boundary between road and wilderness completely erased by snow. The engine idled rough, protesting the cold, as Marcus sat weighing options that all felt impossible. Going out into the storm was dangerous, bordering on stupid. Visibility was near zero. The temperature had dropped to 15 below, and he was alone on a mountain pass where help wouldn't reach him if something went wrong. The smart move was to keep driving, get home, call it in to Sheriff Graves in the morning when the storm passed. Let someone whose job it was to rescue things handle whatever was out there making that sound. Marcus's hand moved toward the gearshift, ready to make the sensible choice. Then the sound came again, and beneath it he heard something else. A lower note, almost like a moan, and then another, higher-pitched, younger maybe. Multiple voices calling into a void that wasn't answering. He killed the engine. The sudden silence inside the cab felt enormous, broken only by the muffled howl of wind against metal and glass. Marcus pulled his coat tighter, checked that his gloves were in his pockets, and grabbed the heavy flashlight from under the seat. The door fought him when he tried to open it, wind pressing back with physical force, but he leaned his shoulder into it and stumbled out into the full fury of the storm. The cold hit him like a fist to the chest, stealing the air from his lungs and making his eyes water instantly. Snow drove sideways, each flake feeling sharp as sand, and within seconds his beard was crusted with ice, his eyebrows heavy with it. The flashlight beam was nearly useless, showing him only the chaos of falling snow and nothing beyond. Marcus moved slowly, testing each step before committing his weight, away from the truck and toward where he thought the sound had originated. His boots sank deep with each step, snow reaching past his knees in places where drifts had piled high. The world had become a place without dimension or direction, just endless white in every direction and the screaming wind that tried to push him back toward the truck, toward safety, toward the easy choice of driving away. Then the flashlight caught something. A dark shape against white, too large to be a fallen branch, too angular to be a boulder. Marcus moved closer, his heart beginning to pound with something beyond just physical exertion. The shape resolved slowly as he approached, becoming a fence post, old and weathered, leaning at an angle that suggested it had been fighting gravity for years. And attached to that post, secured with chains that gleamed dully in the flashlight beam, were 3 horses. Marcus stopped moving, stopped breathing for a moment, his brain struggling to process what his eyes were reporting. The horses were maybe 15 feet away, their bodies pressed close together as if trying to share what little warmth remained between them. Their heads hung low, snow piled thick across their backs and necks, icicles hanging from their manes where breath had frozen into crystals. One of them, a gray mare with a white star on her forehead, lifted her head slowly as the flashlight found her. Her eyes caught the light, reflecting it back with an intensity that seemed to carry accusation and plea in equal measure. Beside her, a chestnut stallion with a black mane pawed at the snow, chains rattling with each movement, the sound metallic and wrong in the organic chaos of the storm. The third horse, smaller than the others, completely black except where snow had turned it white, didn't move at all. Its head remained down, body trembling in a way that Marcus recognized immediately as shock setting in. He moved closer, slowly, hands raised in a gesture that he knew meant nothing to animals but did it anyway because his body needed to do something while his mind raced to catch up. The chains weren't just restraints. They were instruments of deliberate cruelty. Heavy logging chains wrapped multiple times around each horse's legs and secured with padlocks to the fence post. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Someone had done this intentionally, had brought these animals here and bound them in a place where they would either freeze or starve, where no one would find them until spring thaw turned them into evidence of something too dark to name in polite company. The gray mare made a sound. Not the scream he'd heard from the road, but something softer, almost conversational, as if she were trying to explain something important that he needed to understand. The chestnut tossed its head, showing the whites of its eyes, every muscle tensed for flight even though flight was impossible. The black horse, the one Marcus was most worried about, finally lifted its head just enough to look at him. Even through the snow and darkness, Marcus could see the scar tissue along its left shoulder, pale lines where hair would never grow again, and he knew without question that this wasn't the first time someone had hurt this animal. Marcus pulled out his phone with hands that were already starting to lose feeling, but the screen showed no signal, no bars, nothing but the time reading 9:43 and a battery percentage that was dropping faster than it should in the cold. He was alone with this, at least for tonight, and standing here wasn't helping anyone. The horses needed shelter, warmth, food, and medical attention. They needed those chains off before the metal froze their skin or cut circulation completely. They needed things Marcus wasn't sure he could provide, but he was the only option they had, which meant he'd have to become enough. He moved back to the truck, forcing his legs to work against the cold that was seeping through his jeans, and pulled open the extended cab door. In the back he kept emergency supplies, the habits of his paramedic years never quite leaving him even after he'd turned in his certification. A heavy wool blanket, a first aid kit that was probably half useless but better than nothing, a length of rope, and a small crowbar he'd been meaning to return to his toolbox for 6 months. Not enough, nowhere near enough, but it would have to be. The walk back to the horses felt longer than it had the first time. The gray mare watched him approach with eyes that seemed to calculate risk and necessity in ways Marcus understood too well. The chestnut pulled against the chains hard enough that the fence post groaned, snow cascading off its top. The black horse had lowered its head again, as if the effort of staying alert was too much to sustain. Marcus knelt in the snow beside them, his knees instantly soaking through, and examined the chains up close. The padlocks were heavy-duty, the kind you'd use to secure equipment or a storage unit, not the kind you'd break with a crowbar. But the fence post they were attached to was old, soft with rot in places, and that gave him something to work with. He wedged the crowbar between chain and wood, leaning his weight into it, feeling the post resist and then give slightly. The gray mare shifted nervously, chains rattling, but didn't pull away. The chestnut snorted, breath exploding in white clouds, dancing sideways as much as the restraints allowed. Marcus worked the crowbar deeper, splintering with sounds that seemed too loud in the muffled quiet of the storm. And then suddenly the post gave way entirely, cracking at the base and toppling forward. The chains went slack, still attached to the horses but no longer anchoring them to the ground. The chestnut reared immediately, chains swinging, nearly catching Marcus across the face. He fell back into the snow, heart hammering, hands raised to protect his head, but the horse didn't strike. It stood there, sides heaving, wild-eyed and furious, but it didn't run. The gray mare stepped forward, deliberate and calm, until she stood between Marcus and the chestnut, as if offering herself as mediator. The black horse finally moved, taking one careful step, then another, chains dragging through the snow with sounds like rattling bones. Marcus got to his feet slowly, brushing snow from his coat, and reached into his pocket. He'd grabbed an apple from the bowl by his front door on his way out this morning, a habit he'd carried from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The apple was half frozen now, hard as a rock, but he pulled it out and held it in his palm, arm extended. The gray mare's nostrils flared, head lowering to investigate this offering. For long seconds nothing happened. Marcus stood there with his arm out, snow piling on his shoulders, his fingers going numb around the fruit, while the mare decided whether trust was possible or just another trap waiting to close. Then her lips touched his palm, warm and surprisingly gentle, and she took the apple, teeth crunching through frozen flesh with sounds that seemed impossibly loud. She chewed slowly, deliberately, and Marcus felt something shift in his chest, some plate of ice that had been there so long he'd forgotten it was unusual. The chestnut took a half step closer, still tense, still ready to bolt despite the chains. The black horse remained back, watching, but at least it was watching now instead of surrendering to whatever dark place it had been sinking toward. Marcus knew he had to move them, had to get them somewhere warmer before the cold took what the chains and cruelty hadn't managed yet. His truck had a covered bed, not ideal but better than leaving them here. He fashioned a lead from the rope, looping it carefully around the gray mare's neck, speaking in low, steady tones that he hoped conveyed intention if not meaning. She allowed it, this horse he'd already started thinking of as Storm because of the way her gray coat seemed to hold the color of the sky itself. Step by careful step, he led her toward the truck, the chain still attached to her legs dragging behind, and miracle of miracles, she followed. The chestnut came next, more reluctant, fighting the rope until Marcus simply stood still and waited, letting the horse make the choice rather than forcing it. Eventually, with visible reluctance, the chestnut moved, and Marcus led him to the truck where Storm waited, her calm presence seeming to reassure in ways Marcus's voice couldn't. He'd started calling this one ember in his head, for the way his coat seemed to hold fire even under all that snow. The black horse came last, and Marcus had to approach 3 times before it would allow the rope, but finally Shadow, as he'd named it without quite meaning to, followed on trembling legs that barely seemed capable of supporting weight. Getting them into the truck bed was an exercise in patience and prayer. The ramp was slick with ice, the space tight, and every movement risked injury to animals already pushed to their limits. But Storm went first, deliberate and trusting, and her presence convinced the others. When all 3 were finally in, pressed close together beneath the tonneau cover Marcus had pulled over them, he secured the tailgate and stood for a moment with his hand on cold metal, breathing hard, his body shaking from exertion and cold and something deeper that he didn't want to examine too closely. The drive back to the farm took forever and no time at all. Marcus white-knuckled the steering wheel, hyper-aware of the precious cargo behind him, taking turns slower than necessary, feeling every bump and slide as if it were happening to his own body. The property gate appeared in his headlights like a miracle, familiar and foreign at the same time. He hadn't approached his own home with this sense of purpose in 3 years. The barn waited beyond, a dark bulk against darker sky, and Marcus felt his stomach tighten as he drove closer. He hadn't opened those doors since he'd moved here, hadn't been able to face what waited inside, the physical remnants of his uncle's life and the boxes of his own past he'd shoved inside when unpacking felt impossible. Tonight, he didn't have the luxury of avoidance. He parked as close as possible, killed the engine, and sat for one more moment in the cab's relative warmth before stepping out into the cold again. The barn doors fought him, swollen with moisture and years of disuse, but he leaned into them with his shoulder and they gave way with a shriek of rusted hinges that sounded like a warning or a welcome. He couldn't tell which. The inside smelled of dust and old hay and something deeper, the particular scent of time passing in an enclosed space where nothing new ever enters. His flashlight beam cut through darkness, showing him a space larger than he'd remembered, stalls lining both sides, a loft above where hay bales still sat from harvests a decade past. Cobwebs draped like curtains, small animal tracks marked dust on the floor. But the roof looked sound, the walls solid, and there was hay and what looked like a water trough that might work if he could get it clean. Marcus worked quickly, spreading hay in 3 stalls, checking for nails or hazards, hauling buckets of snow to melt for water because the pipes had been winterized years ago. His body moved on autopilot, paramedic training kicking in, triaging needs and addressing them in order of urgency. The horses needed to be out of the cold. They needed water and food. The chains needed to come off, though that would require bolt cutters he didn't have. Tomorrow's problem. Tonight was about survival, about making it through the dark hours to reach dawn. He led them in one at a time, Storm first because she'd become the anchor point, the one the others looked to. She entered the barn with her head high, nostrils flaring at new smells, but she didn't balk. Ember came next, still skittish, still ready to bolt, chains rattling against wooden floors in rhythms that made Marcus's jaw tight. Shadow entered last, moving like every step cost something precious, and when Marcus finally got him into a stall with hay and water, the black horse simply stood there, head down, not eating, barely breathing, as if he'd used up his entire reserve of wool just getting this far. Marcus stood in the center of the barn, surrounded by the sounds of animals adjusting to new space. Their breathing and shifting and the chains that still bound them making a symphony of survival that echoed in the rafters above. His clothes were soaked through, his hands and feet numb, exhaustion pulling at him with weight that felt like it might take him under. But beneath all of that, unexpected and unwelcome, something else stirred. A sense of purpose he'd thought burned away in that fire 3 years ago. A reason to make sure morning came and he was still standing when it did. He found an old horse blanket in a corner, moth-eaten but serviceable, and draped it over Shadow's back. The horse flinched but didn't move away. Storm was already pulling hay from the pile Marcus had spread, chewing with methodical determination. Ember paced his stall, testing boundaries, but he wasn't screaming anymore, wasn't trying to tear the walls down. For tonight, that was enough. Marcus made his way to the barn door, looking back once at the 3 lives that were now somehow his responsibility. In the dim light of the flashlight, with snow still swirling outside and darkness pressing close, They looked like ghosts, like something he'd imagined in the storm. But the sound of their breathing was real. The weight of what he'd taken on settled across his shoulders. Real. The choice he'd made when he stopped the truck instead of driving past was real, and there was no taking it back now even if he wanted to. He pulled the barn doors closed, not latching them in case something went wrong and he needed fast access, and trudged through snow toward the farmhouse that waited dark and cold. Tomorrow would bring questions he didn't have answers for. Questions about bolt cutters and veterinarians and whether what he'd done was rescue or just delaying the inevitable. Questions about chains and cruelty and who would leave 3 horses to die on a mountain pass in a blizzard. Questions about himself and whether he had anything left to give or if he was just going through motions that mimicked care without the substance beneath. But tonight he'd done what he could. He'd stopped when driving past would have been easier. He'd acted when doing nothing would have cost less. And in the barn behind him, 3 hearts kept beating that wouldn't have made it through the night otherwise. Marcus stood on his porch, looking back at the dark shape of the barn, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than the vast emptiness that had become his constant companion. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was smaller and more fragile than that. But it was something, and something was more than he'd had when the sun went down. Morning arrived without fanfare, just a gradual lightening of the sky from black to gray to a pale blue that held no warmth. Marcus had barely slept, his body too wired from adrenaline and cold, his mind replaying the events of the previous night on an endless loop. Every time he'd started to drift off, he'd jerk awake with the image of those 3 horses chained in the snow, or worse, the image of driving past them, of choosing comfort over action. He'd finally given up around 5 and made coffee that tasted like regret and exhaustion, standing at his kitchen window watching the barn as if he could see through its walls to verify that what happened last night was real and not some fever dream born of isolation and storm. The thermometer outside the window read 8 degrees. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed into something pristine and merciless. Snow covered everything in smooth drifts that caught the early light and threw it back in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if Marcus had any capacity left to appreciate beauty. The road would be impassable for hours, maybe days, until the county plows made it through. He was alone with this situation, with these animals, with choices that felt too heavy for one man to carry. He dressed in layers, thermal underwear beneath jeans, 2 shirts under his heavy coat, and made his way across the yard to the barn. His boots broke through the crust of snow with each step, the sound sharp in the morning quiet. Smoke rose from his chimney, the only sign of human habitation in a landscape that otherwise looked untouched by civilization. As he approached the barn, he heard sounds from within that made his chest tighten with something that might have been relief. Movement, shuffling, the low sound of a horse breathing. They'd made it through the night. The barn doors protested less this morning, or maybe he was just stronger with daylight and purpose to help him. The interior was warmer than outside, body heat from 3 large animals and the insulation of old walls creating a microclimate that felt almost comfortable. Storm stood in her stall with her head over the gate, ears forward, watching him enter with an alertness that suggested she'd been waiting for him. Ember was in the back corner of his stall, pressed against the wall, tension written in every line of his body, but at least he was standing. Shadow hadn't moved from where Marcus had left him last night. Still in the center of the stall, head down, the horse blanket slipped sideways off his back. Marcus approached Storm first, speaking softly, words that meant nothing but tone that hopefully conveyed peaceful intent. She allowed him close, allowed his hand on her neck, and up close in better light, he could see the full extent of what had been done to her. The chains had rubbed hair away in rings around all 4 legs, the skin beneath raw and weeping in places. Her ribs showed too clearly beneath her winter coat. Her eyes, though alert, carried shadows in them that spoke of ordeals Marcus could only imagine. He ran his hands down her legs carefully, checking for breaks or serious injury, and she stood patient through his examination as if she understood he was trying to help. The chains were still locked, thick links that had no give to them, padlocks that weren't going to open without the right tools. Marcus had a toolkit in the house, basic stuff for farm repairs, but nothing that would cut through hardened steel. He'd need bolt cutters, the heavy-duty kind, and he'd need them today. The longer those chains stayed on, the more damage they'd do, infection setting in where metal had broken skin, circulation potentially compromised. He made a mental list as he worked, checking Storm over thoroughly, noting injuries, calculating needs. Bolt cutters, veterinary supplies, more food, salt blocks, blankets. The list grew longer the more he thought about it. Ember allowed him into the stall but not close, circling away when Marcus approached, snorting warnings that were clear even across species barriers. Marcus didn't push it. He could see from where he stood that this horse was in similar condition to Storm, underweight, injured by the chains, but also carrying something else. Anger maybe, or trauma so deep it had transformed into rage. The chestnut's eyes weren't just afraid, they were furious, and Marcus recognized that particular combination from his years working emergency response. People who'd been hurt badly enough sometimes turned that pain outward, became dangerous not because they wanted to hurt others, but because it was the only way they knew to protect themselves from being hurt again. Shadow was what worried him most. The black horse still hadn't lifted his head, hadn't acknowledged Marcus's presence in any meaningful way. When Marcus entered the stall, moving slowly and speaking constantly, Shadow flinched but didn't move away, as if movement required more energy than he possessed. Up close, the damage was worse than Marcus had realized in the dark. The scar on the left shoulder wasn't just surface level, it was deep tissue damage, old and poorly healed, the kind that would have required medical intervention and instead had been left to heal however it could. The chains around Shadow's legs had cut deeper than on the other two horses, infection already setting in around the wounds, the skin hot to the touch and swelling in ways that made Marcus's stomach turn. He'd seen injuries like this before in his other life, in the back of ambulances and emergency rooms. Neglect compounded by cruelty, compounded by time, until the body started shutting down systems to preserve core functions. Shadow was in shock, physically and possibly mentally, and Marcus didn't have the resources here to treat that properly. He needed a veterinarian, needed someone who actually knew what they were doing with horses. But getting one here would mean making phone calls, explaining situations, bringing other people into this barn where Marcus had barely managed to bring himself. The sound of an engine cut through his thoughts. Marcus straightened, heart rate jumping, and moved to the barn door to look out. A vehicle was making its way up the drive, moving slowly through the snow. A Jeep with chains on the tires and a familiar profile behind the wheel. Maria Rodriguez. Of course it would be Maria, the woman who'd made it her personal mission to ensure Marcus didn't completely disappear into his grief. The Jeep pulled up near the barn and the driver's door opened, Maria emerging bundled in a parka that made her look twice her actual size. Her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her face set in an expression Marcus had learned to recognize as determination masquerading as casual concern. She trudged through the snow toward the barn carrying a cardboard box, and Marcus stepped out to meet her before she could come inside, before she could see what he'd brought home last night. But Maria had never been easily deterred. She took one look at his face, at the way he'd positioned himself in the doorway, and her eyes narrowed with the particular suspicion of someone who'd raised 3 children through their teenage years and knew when someone was hiding something. "You look terrible," she said by way of greeting. "When's the last time you slept?" Marcus rubbed a hand across his face, feeling stubble that had become a beard somewhere in the last few months. "Last night was complicated," he offered, which was maybe the understatement of the year. Maria shifted the box to one hip and crossed her arms. "I brought breakfast. Figured the road would be bad and you probably didn't stock up before the storm." She paused, head tilting slightly. "What's that sound?" From inside the barn, Ember chose that moment to kick the wall of his stall, the impact resonating like a drum. Marcus watched Maria's expression shift from concerned to confused to something sharper, and he knew he'd lost any chance of keeping this quiet. She stepped around him before he could think to stop her, moving into the barn with the confidence of someone who'd spent half her life around animals, and stopped dead when she saw Storm looking over the stall door. Marcus, her voice had gone flat, carefully neutral in the way people do when they're trying not to jump to conclusions. "Why is there a horse in your barn?" 3 horses, he corrected, because there was no point in understating it now. "Found them last night on Whitefish Pass. They were chained to a fence post in the middle of the storm." The words came out matter-of-fact, clinical, but Maria's face went through several expressions in quick succession. landing somewhere between horror and fury. She set the box down on a hay bale and approached Storm's stall, her movements slow and measured. The mare watched her come, ears forward, and allowed Maria to get close enough to see the chains still locked around her legs, to see the raw wounds and the way the horse's ribs showed through her coat. Maria's hands came up to her mouth, then dropped. Dios mío, she breathed. Who would do this? That's what I'd like to know, Marcus said, moving to stand beside her. He told her about finding them, about the fence post and the padlocks, about the drive home and the long night, making sure they survived until morning. Maria listened with the focused attention she gave to everything important, and when he finished she turned to look at him with something in her eyes he couldn't quite name. You need help, she said simply. This isn't a one-person job. I know, Marcus admitted, and saying it out loud felt like releasing something he'd been holding too tightly. I need bolt cutters, veterinary supplies, probably an actual veterinarian. I don't even know where to start. Maria pulled out her phone, frowned at the screen, then looked up. I've got signal. Barely, but it's there. I'm calling Ben Foster. You remember him? Marcus dredged through memory, found a vague recollection of a quiet man with kind eyes who'd treated his uncle's dogs years ago. The vet, he said. Maria was already dialing. He owes me a favor. Actually, he owes me several favors. And he's not going to say no to this. While Maria spoke in rapid Spanish into her phone, Marcus went back to checking on the horses, giving her space and himself time to adjust to the fact that this was no longer a private burden. Storm seemed calmer with Maria's presence, as if the addition of another human with gentle hands had reassured something in her. Ember was still agitated, still pacing, but he'd stopped kicking the walls. Shadow hadn't moved, and that stillness was becoming more frightening than any amount of aggression would have been. Maria ended the call and came to stand beside Marcus at Shadow's stall. Ben's coming. He's got to wait for the county to clear some of the secondary roads, but he said he'll be here by afternoon. She looked at the black horse, at the way he stood so utterly still, and her voice dropped. That one's in bad shape. The worst, Marcus agreed. I don't know if he's going to eat. Haven't seen him drink either. Maria chewed her lip, thinking, then turned to head back to the box she'd brought. She returned with a container of something that smelled sweet and earthy. Molasses, she said. My grandfather used to mix it with oats for horses that wouldn't eat. Makes it more appealing. Worth a try anyway. They worked together in the quiet of the barn, Maria moving with a competence that suggested this wasn't her first time around horses. Marcus following her lead and grateful for it. She mixed molasses with some of the hay, creating sweet-smelling clumps that she offered first to Storm. The mare took it readily, and Maria smiled, the expression transforming her face into something younger. There's a girl, she murmured. You know good food when you see it. Ember took some coaxing but eventually approached enough to snatch a mouthful from Maria's hand before retreating. Shadow ignored the offering completely, didn't even seem to register that humans were in his stall trying to help. Maria stood back, hands on hips, studying the black horse with an expression that Marcus had seen her use on broken equipment and sick children, equal parts assessment and determination. He needs 4 fluids, she said. Antibiotics, probably. Those wounds around his legs are infected. Marcus knew she was right, knew that Shadow needed more than they could provide here in a barn with no running water and temperatures that barely stayed above freezing even with the animal's body heat helping. But moving him seemed impossible in his current state, and besides, where would they take him? The nearest emergency veterinary clinic was in Kalispell, over an hour away on good roads, probably 3 or 4 hours in current conditions assuming the passes were even open. We do what we can until Ben gets here, Marcus said finally. Keep him warm, keep offering food and water. Hope that's enough to get him through until we have better options. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. Maria nodded, accepting the limitations without complaint, and they fell into a routine of care that felt both foreign and strangely familiar to Marcus. His hands remembered how to check vital signs, how to assess responsiveness, how to work efficiently in crisis situations even if the patients had 4 legs instead of 2. Emma appeared around mid-morning, materializing in the barn doorway like a small, curious ghost. She was wrapped in a purple jacket 2 sizes too big and snow pants that swished when she walked, her dark curls escaping from beneath a knitted cap. "Mama said you needed help," she announced, her voice carrying the absolute confidence of children who haven't learned yet to doubt their welcome. She looked past Marcus to where Storm stood in her stall, and her eyes went wide. "You really do have horses?" Her voice was hushed, reverent, as if she'd stumbled into a cathedral. Marcus glanced at Maria, who shrugged. She insisted on coming. "And honestly, another pair of hands won't hurt." Emma was already moving toward Storm's stall, her steps careful but unafraid, and Storm's ears pricked forward with interest. The girl stopped just outside the stall door, hands clasped in front of her as if to keep them from reaching out without permission. "Can I pet her?" she asked, directing the question to Marcus with a seriousness that made him want to smile despite everything. "Slowly," he said. "Let her smell you first. Make sure she's comfortable." Emma extended her hand, palm up, and Storm stretched her neck over the stall door to investigate. The mare's nostrils flared, breath warm and loud in the quiet barn. And then she lowered her head to bump against Emma's palm with gentle insistence. The girl's face lit up with a joy so pure it was almost painful to witness, and Marcus had to look away, had to push down the memory of another child. His child, feeding carrots to horses at a petting zoo, laughing when their lips tickled his palm. "What's her name?" Emma asked, already scratching between Storm's ears with the unself-conscious affection children give so easily. "Storm," Marcus said, the name feeling more real now that he'd spoken it to someone else. "This one's Ember," gesturing to the chestnut who was watching the proceedings from the back of his stall. "And that's Shadow." Emma looked at each horse in turn, her expression going serious when she saw Shadow's stillness. "Is he okay?" she asked. "Working on it," Maria said before Marcus could formulate an answer. "That's why Dr. Foster is coming. Sometimes animals need extra help when they've been through something hard." Emma accepted this with a nod, then turned back to Storm. "Can I help? I'm really good at helping. I help Mama at the store all the time." Marcus found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided to agree. "You can help Maria with the hay. Make sure everyone has fresh water. And if you want, you can sit with Shadow for a bit. Sometimes company helps even when nothing else does." It was something a nurse had told him once, in the hospital, when Sarah had been sleeping more than waking and Marcus had felt useless sitting beside machines that beeped out the only news that mattered. "Your presence matters," the nurse had said. "Even if she doesn't respond, she knows you're there." Emma took her job seriously, spreading hay with careful attention to detail, filling water buckets that were too heavy for her to carry without sloshing, and finally settling herself on an overturned crate outside Shadow's stall. She talked to the black horse in a steady stream of consciousness, telling him about her school, her friends, the book she was reading about a girl who could talk to animals. Shadow didn't react, didn't lift his head or acknowledge her voice, but Marcus noticed that his breathing seemed to steady slightly, the rapid shallow pattern easing into something more rhythmic. Ben Foster arrived just after 2, driving a truck that had seen better decades and pulling a small trailer that probably held his mobile veterinary equipment. He was older than Marcus remembered, gray threading through dark hair, lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting at animals in various states of distress. He moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste energy on unnecessary motion, and when he entered the barn his presence seemed to settle something in the space, as if the building itself recognized expertise. Maria made introductions that Marcus barely registered, too focused on the way Ben was already assessing the horses, his gaze moving from one to the next with the practiced evaluation of a professional. Storm let him approach without fuss, standing patient while his hands moved over her body, checking joints and teeth and the chain wounds with gentle thoroughness. Ember required more caution, Ben moving slowly and speaking in tones too low for Marcus to hear, but eventually the chestnut allowed examination, though tension never left his frame. Shadow was last, and Ben's expression tightened when he saw the black horse's condition. "How long has he been like this?" Ben asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Since I found them last night," Marcus said. "Maybe 10-12 hours." Ben made a sound that wasn't quite agreement or disagreement, just acknowledgement, and continued his examination. When he finally straightened, his face was grave. "The other 2 are malnourished and injured, but they'll recover with proper care and time." This one, he gestured to Shadow, is critical. Severe infection in all 4 legs, possible sepsis starting, definitely dehydrated and in shock. He needs aggressive treatment starting immediately or we're going to lose him. The words hit Marcus harder than they should have. This horse he'd known for less than a day becoming suddenly, irrationally important. What do you need? He asked. Ben was already moving back to his truck, Marcus and Maria following. I've got antibiotics, for equipment, wound care supplies. I can start treatment here, but he really should be at a facility where we can monitor him constantly. The roads, Marcus started, but Ben waved him off. I know. We work with what we have. But you need to understand, even with treatment, his chances aren't great. The infection is advanced and his body is already compromised. Sometimes the will to survive matters as much as medical intervention, and right now I'm not sure he has that will. They carried supplies into the barn, Ben directing them with quick efficiency, and soon Shadow's stall had been transformed into a makeshift treatment area. The black horse barely reacted when Ben inserted the 4, when he cleaned and dressed the wounds, when he administered injections of antibiotics and anti-inflammatories. Emma watched from her crate, her eyes huge, her hands twisted together in her lap. Is he going to die? She asked, her voice small in a way it hadn't been before. Ben looked at her, and Marcus saw him make the choice to be honest rather than comforting. I don't know, sweetheart. He's very sick, but we're doing everything we can, and sometimes that's enough. They worked into the evening, Ben showing Marcus and Maria how to change 4 bags, how to clean wounds properly, how to monitor for signs of improvement or decline. Emma helped where she could and provided commentary where she couldn't, her presence somehow making the clinical procedures feel less sterile, more human. When Ben finally packed up to leave, promising to return in the morning, the barn felt different than it had 12 hours ago. More like a hospital than a shelter, the smell of antiseptic mixing with hay and horse, but also more alive, more purposeful. Maria left with Emma as darkness fell, promising to return with food and more supplies, her Jeep's taillights disappearing down the drive and leaving Marcus alone. With the horses again. He made one more round, checking that Storm and Ember had everything they needed, that Shadow's 4 was flowing properly, that blankets were secure and water was fresh. The black horse's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow but steady, and Marcus found himself reaching out to rest a hand on Shadow's neck, feeling the warmth of life still persisting despite everything. You have to fight, Marcus said quietly, not sure if he was talking to the horse or himself. I didn't pull you out of that storm just to lose you now. We both didn't. His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and he realized with some surprise that tears were running down his face, the first he'd shed since the funeral 3 years ago. They fell onto his hand where it rested on Shadow's neck, soaking into dark hair, and Marcus didn't bother to wipe them away. He stood there in the dim barn with his hand on a dying horse, finally allowing himself to feel the enormity of what he'd taken on, the weight of responsibility and care, and the terrifying possibility that caring might not be enough. Storm nickered softly from her stall, a sound that might have been encouragement or simple acknowledgement. Ember had stopped pacing, standing quiet in the shadows, and Shadow breathed beneath Marcus's hand. Each inhalation and exhalation, a small victory against the darkness that wanted to claim him. Marcus stayed there until his legs ached and his hand went numb, stayed until the tears stopped and the grief transformed into something harder and more durable. Determination maybe, or stubbornness, or just the simple refusal to let go when holding on was still possible. When he finally made his way back to the house, the barn lights glowing behind him in the dark, Marcus felt hollowed out and heavy at the same time. But beneath the exhaustion was something else, faint but present. A sense that he'd stumbled into something important on that snow-covered road, something that mattered in ways he couldn't fully articulate yet. 3 horses that needed him, that depended on him, that wouldn't survive without the choice he'd made to stop instead of driving past. It was terrifying and overwhelming and more responsibility than he'd wanted to take on. But it was also, Marcus realized as he stood on his porch looking back at the barn, the first thing in 3 years that had made him feel like maybe, just maybe, there was a reason to keep going. Not happiness, not yet. Not healing in any complete sense. But purpose, small and fragile, taking root in frozen ground where nothing had grown for so long. He went inside to a house that felt less empty than it had the night before, made coffee he wouldn't drink, and settled in to wait for morning, listening for sounds from the barn that would tell him 3 hearts were still beating in the dark. The sky was shifting from black to navy when Marcus gave up on the pretense of sleep and returned to the barn. Storm greeted him with a low nicker that sounded almost like welcome. Ember shifted restlessly in his stall, and Shadow, miracle of small miracles, had his head up slightly, eyes half open and aware in a way they hadn't been the night before. Marcus checked the wounds, and allowed himself the smallest flicker of hope that maybe Ben's aggressive treatment was working, that maybe will and medicine together might be enough after all. He was mixing molasses with hay when he heard the sound of vehicles approaching, plural, more than one. Marcus stepped outside to see Ben's truck leading a small convoy, Maria's Jeep behind him, and another vehicle Marcus didn't recognize bringing up the rear. They parked in a line near the barn, doors opening to reveal not just the people he expected but others too. Tom Morrison from the feed store, his weathered face neutral but his truck bed full of hay bales. Claire Zhang, the town nurse, carrying what looked like medical supplies. Pastor Julie Webb with containers of food and a practical determination in her eyes. Marcus stood frozen, watching them approach, watching this small army of people who'd apparently decided that his problem was their problem too. Maria was the first to reach him, her expression a mixture of apology and defiance. News travels fast in small towns, she said. People wanted to help. She gestured to the group assembling behind her. We brought supplies, manpower, whatever you need. You don't have to do this alone. The words hit something in Marcus's chest, cracking it open, and he found he couldn't speak around the sudden tightness in his throat. He nodded instead, a jerky motion that probably didn't convey the depth of what he was feeling, but was all he could manage. The group moved into action with the practiced coordination of people who'd worked together through countless community crises, organizing supplies, dividing tasks, transforming the barn from Marcus's solitary burden into something communal. Tom Morrison hauled hay bales with the steady rhythm of someone half his age, stacking them neatly and showing Marcus the proper way to store them for maximum freshness. Claire checked on Shadow with professional competence, cross-referencing Ben's treatment notes with her own medical knowledge and making suggestions that Ben accepted with nods and adjustments. Pastor Julie set up a small station with coffee and food, her presence less about religion and more about the practical spirituality of showing up when people needed you. And Emma darted between them all, fetching and carrying and providing enthusiastic commentary on everything happening. Ben worked on getting the chains off, bolt cutters he'd brought making quick work of the padlocks that had seemed so insurmountable the night before. Each chain that fell away felt like releasing something larger than just metal and weight, felt like possibility returning to bodies that had been denied it. Storm stood patient through the process, as if she'd been waiting for this moment with quiet certainty. Ember danced and fretted but submitted eventually, and when the last chain fell from his legs he reared slightly, not in aggression but in something that looked almost like celebration. Shadow barely reacted, but Marcus thought he saw the black horse's ears flick forward slightly when the metal fell away, as if some part of him registered freedom even through the fog of illness. With the chains removed, Ben could treat the wounds properly, cleaning and bandaging with Maria assisting and Marcus watching, trying to memorize the process for the twice-daily dressing changes that would be needed. The injuries looked worse without the chains obscuring them, raw circles of damaged tissue that would take weeks to heal, but at least now they could breathe, could start the slow process of recovery without metal constantly aggravating the damage. Claire produced something she called wound gel that she swore by, and Ben applied it liberally while explaining to Marcus the signs of infection. To watch for, when to call him immediately versus when to just document and continue treatment. Tom Morrison appeared at Marcus's elbow with a mug of coffee that was actually hot, having somehow coaxed the ancient outlet in the barn to power an electric kettle Claire had brought. "Heard what you did," Tom said without preamble. "Driving out in that storm, bringing them back here. That took guts." Marcus shrugged, uncomfortable with praise for what had felt like simply the only possible choice. "Someone had to," he said. Tom made a sound that might have been agreement. "Someone did," he corrected gently. "Most people would have driven past, told themselves it wasn't their problem. You didn't. That means something." The morning stretched into afternoon, the barn transforming under the collective effort. Someone had brought lights, battery-powered lanterns that pushed back shadows and made the space feel larger, warmer. The horses had fresh hay, clean water, and wounds that were properly bandaged. Shadow's forebag had been changed twice, antibiotics flowing into his system, and while he wasn't miraculously improved, he also wasn't worse, which Ben said was the best they could hope for in the first 24 hours. Emma had claimed Storm as her special responsibility, grooming the mare with a brush Claire had found somewhere, talking constantly while Storm stood with an expression that Marcus could only describe as patient amusement. It was Pastor Julie who brought up what everyone had probably been thinking but no one had voiced yet. Someone did this deliberately, she said, her tone matter-of-fact despite the horror of the statement. Someone chained them out there and left them to die. The question is who and what we do about it. The barn went quiet, all activity pausing. Marcus felt everyone's attention shift to him, waiting for him to lead a conversation he didn't feel qualified to have. I called Sheriff Graves this morning, Ben said into the silence. Reported what we found. She said she'd start asking questions, checking if anyone reported horses missing, looking into who uses that section of Whitefish Pass regularly. But, Maria added, her voice hard in a way Marcus hadn't heard before, it's a big county, lots of back roads. Easy for people to do things they don't want witnessed. We might never know who did this. The thought settled over the group like a weight. The idea that cruelty could go unpunished, that whoever had chained 3 horses to die in a blizzard might never face consequences, was difficult to swallow. Marcus looked at Storm, at Ember, at Shadow lying quiet in his stall with tubes running into his neck, and felt anger kindle in his chest, hot and clean. Maybe we don't find who did it, he said slowly. But we make sure they don't get these horses back. Whatever it takes, they stay here, they stay safe. The group murmured agreement, a sound that felt like something being sworn, a pact made in a barn that smelled of hay and horse and the particular sweetness of molasses. They stayed until evening, working until there was nothing left to do but wait and see if Shadow's condition would stabilize, if Storm and Ember would continue to eat and drink, if the fragile foundation they'd built today would hold. When they finally dispersed, promising to return tomorrow and the day after and however long it took, Marcus stood in the barn doorway watching them go, vehicle lights disappearing one by one down the drive. The barn felt too quiet after they left, but it wasn't the oppressive silence Marcus had lived with for 3 years. This was the quiet of held breath, of anticipation, of possibility waiting to unfold. He made his final rounds of the evening, checking each horse, adjusting blankets, ensuring water buckets were full. Storm bumped his shoulder with her nose when he lingered by her stall, a gesture that felt like reassurance or gratitude or maybe just acknowledgement. Ember watched him from the shadows, still wary but no longer actively hostile. And Shadow, when Marcus finally knelt beside him to check the 4-1 last time, opened his eyes fully and looked at him with something that might have been recognition. You're still here, Marcus whispered to the black horse. That's good. That's really good. Keep fighting, okay? We're all fighting for you. He stayed there for a long moment, hand resting on Shadow's shoulder, feeling the warmth of living flesh and the steady rhythm of a heart that refused to stop despite having every reason to give up. When he finally stood, his knees protesting the cold floor, Marcus realized something had shifted in him too. The numbness that had defined his existence since the fire had developed cracks, light getting through in ways he hadn't thought possible anymore. He closed up the barn with more care than he'd approached anything in years, double-checking doors, ensuring the battery lights were positioned to last through the night, creating a mental checklist of everything he'd need to do when dawn came. The walk back to his house felt different than it had all the other nights he'd made this journey. His home was still empty of people, still full of memories that hurt to face, but it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a place he lived, from which he went out every morning to care for creatures who needed him, to whom he returned every night having done something that mattered. Marcus made dinner without really tasting it, his mind replaying the day, the image of chains falling away from legs, Emma's delighted smile when Storm took the apple from her hand, the quiet competence of people showing up with supplies and strong backs, and the simple gift of presence. He thought about Tom Morrison's words about how most people would have driven past, and wondered what makes some people stop and others keep going. He didn't feel particularly brave or special. He'd just been tired and sad and maybe a little bit broken when he'd heard those horses crying in the storm, and stopping had seemed less like courage and more like simply being unable to do otherwise. The night pressed against his windows, cold and dark and infinite. Marcus stood at the glass looking out toward the barn where 3 horses were fighting for health and wholeness, where chains had been cut away but scars remained, where small victories measured in stable vital signs and hay eaten felt as significant as any triumph he'd experienced in his other life. He thought about Sarah and David, about the way grief had convinced him that caring about anything ever again was too dangerous, too costly, too likely to end in more loss he couldn't survive. But standing in his kitchen with coffee gone cold in his cup and exhaustion pulling at every muscle, Marcus realized that maybe the opposite was true. Maybe the danger wasn't in caring but in the slow death that came from choosing not to, from driving past every cry for help because stopping meant risking the pain of loss. Those horses might die despite everything he and Ben and the whole community did to save them. Shadow especially remained precarious, his condition critical enough that every hour he survived felt like borrowed time. The outcome wasn't guaranteed, had never been guaranteed, would never be something Marcus could control no matter how much he wanted to. But he'd stopped. He'd brought them home. He'd spent 2 days fighting for their survival with everything he had, and in doing so had maybe accidentally started fighting for his own survival too. The realization didn't come with trumpets or sudden joy, just a quiet recognition that he cared what happened tomorrow, that he wanted to see Shadow open his eyes again, wanted to watch Storm's wounds heal, wanted to witness Ember learn that not all humans meant harm. He wanted futures that hadn't existed 2 days ago, and wanting anything at all felt like waking up after a 3-year sleep. Marcus finished his coffee cold, rinsed the cup, and made his way to the bedroom that still held Sarah's things in drawers he hadn't opened since moving here. Tonight he opened one, carefully, and pulled out a sweater she'd loved, soft blue wool that still somehow held the faint scent of her perfume. He held it for a moment, letting himself remember without drowning in it, then set it aside and pulled out a pair of thick socks that would be warmer than his current ones for barn work. Taking care of himself so he could take care of others felt like a foreign concept, but maybe it was one he needed to relearn. He set his alarm for 4, knowing Shadow would need his 4 checked and adjusted, knowing dawn would come whether he was ready or not, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own challenges and small victories and the continuing question of whether choosing to care was enough to make a difference. Marcus lay in the dark listening to wind against the house and the distant sound of something that might have been coyotes or might have been his imagination, and felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like a blanket. It was heavy, that weight, but it was also warm, also real, also proof that he was still capable of carrying something beyond his own grief. Sleep came eventually, thin and full of dreams where horses ran free through snow that didn't slow them, where chains dissolved like smoke, where a black horse opened his eyes and stood and took his first steps toward a horizon that held promise instead of threat. Marcus woke before his alarm, dressed in the dark, and made his way through pre-dawn cold toward a barn where 3 lives hung in balance and his own, somehow, had gotten tangled up with theirs in ways he was only beginning to understand. The 4th morning arrived with a sky the color of old bruises, heavy clouds pressing low over Iron Ridge and promising more snow before nightfall. Marcus had been up since 3:30, unable to sleep through his alarm's intended time, his body clock already adjusting to the demands of animals who needed care regardless of human exhaustion. He dressed in the dark, pulling on Sarah's wool socks beneath his boots and finding they fit well enough. Finding, too, that wearing something of hers didn't hurt quite as much as he'd expected. The sweater he'd left folded on the dresser, not ready for that yet. But the socks felt like a manageable step toward remembering without being consumed. The barn had taken on a different character in just a few days. No longer the abandoned shell he'd avoided for years, but a space that hummed with purpose and need. Marcus had started leaving one of the battery lanterns on low through the night, partly for practical reasons of being able to see during his early checks, but also because the warm glow seemed to comfort the horses in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Storm was already awake when he entered, her ears tracking his movement through the pre-dawn gloom, and she greeted him with a soft sound that had become their morning ritual. He stopped at her stall first, running his hands down her legs to check the healing wounds, pleased to find the swelling had reduced noticeably since Ben had removed the chains. Ember was standing alert in his stall, tension still written in every line of his body, but the wild panic had eased into something more like watchfulness. The chestnut allowed Marcus to approach now, though he never fully relaxed, muscles always coiled as if ready to flee or fight depending on which seemed safer. Marcus had started bringing apple slices with him on every visit, offering them on his palm and waiting with patient stillness while Ember decided whether accepting food was worth the vulnerability of getting close. This morning Ember took the apple faster than yesterday, his teeth grazing Marcus's palm with delicate precision, and Marcus counted it as progress even as his heart hammered at how easily those same teeth could have taken fingers if the horse had chosen differently. Shadow was the constant worry, the variable that could tip toward disaster with little warning. The black horse had shown small improvements, his eyes more alert, his head lifting occasionally to track sounds or movement, but he still wouldn't eat solid food and the fever that had spiked on the second day hadn't fully broken. Ben had warned Marcus that sepsis was still a real possibility, that the infection in Shadow's legs was fighting the antibiotics with stubborn persistence, that the next 48 hours would likely determine whether the horse had enough reserve to pull through or whether his body would simply surrender to the accumulated damage of weeks or months of neglect and cruelty. Marcus knelt beside Shadow's prone form, checking the 4-line that delivered fluids and medication in steady drips, cleaning the insertion site with the careful attention Ben had taught him, watching for signs of infiltration or infection at the catheter point. Shadow's breathing was steady this morning, not labored, and his temperature when Marcus checked was down 0.5 degree from the previous night. Small victories, Marcus reminded himself. Recovery wasn't a straight line but a series of incremental improvements and setbacks, and the only thing he could do was show up every few hours and do the work regardless of how the outcome might resolve. He was adjusting Shadow's blanket when he heard the sound of a vehicle approaching, engine noise carrying clearly in the still air. Too early for Ben's scheduled visit. Too early for Maria or any of the others who'd been stopping by with supplies and assistance. Marcus straightened, moving to the barn entrance with a wariness that came from having learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. A black SUV with tinted windows was making its way up the drive, moving with the careful precision of someone unfamiliar with rural roads in winter. And when it parked near the barn, a man emerged who looked profoundly out of place against the backdrop of snow and weathered buildings. He wore a long wool coat that probably cost more than Marcus's truck, polished leather shoes utterly inappropriate for the conditions, and carried himself with the particular arrogance of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. His face was tanned despite the season, his dark hair styled with product that caught the weak morning light, and when he smiled it didn't reach his eyes. Marcus felt his shoulders tense, some instinct warning him that this man represented danger of a different kind than storms or infection. The man picked his way through the snow with obvious distaste, stopping just outside the barn entrance as if crossing the threshold would contaminate him somehow. Marcus Chen. His voice was smooth, professionally friendly in the way of people who'd trained themselves to sound pleasant while meaning nothing by it. Marcus nodded once, not offering his hand, waiting. The man's smile widened fractionally. Victor Drummond. I own Silver Creek Ranch about 40 miles south of here. I believe you have something that belongs to me. The words hung in the cold air between them, and Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He'd known this was coming, had known since finding those padlocks that someone would eventually show up claiming ownership. But having it happen this morning when Shadow was still fighting for life and all 3 horses remained vulnerable felt like particularly cruel timing. Don't know what you're talking about? Marcus said carefully, keeping his voice neutral even as anger kindled in his chest. Drummond's expression shifted slightly, the fake friendliness hardening into something more calculated. 3 horses, gray mare, chestnut stallion, black gelding. They were part of my training stock. Got loose during the storm, must have wandered up this way. I've been looking for them, heard through channels that you might have found them. He paused, gaze flicking past Marcus toward the barn interior. I'm here to take them home. Every word out of Drummond's mouth felt like a lie wrapped in casual authority, and Marcus had to consciously unclench his fists to keep from doing something stupid. Horses I found were chained to a fence post in the middle of a blizzard, he said, his voice low and hard. Padlocked, left to die. That's not loose livestock, that's criminal neglect at minimum, animal cruelty more likely. So before you take anything anywhere, maybe you want to explain how your training stock ended up abandoned in a snowstorm. Something flickered across Drummond's face, gone too quickly to identify but leaving a residue of cold calculation. That's an unfortunate misunderstanding, he said smoothly. I employ several ranch hands. It's possible one of them secured the horses improperly when the storm hit, thought they'd be safer tied up than running loose. Poor judgment certainly, and I'll be addressing it with my staff, but not criminal. Just a mistake made under difficult circumstances. The explanation was too practiced, too ready, and Marcus knew with absolute certainty that Drummond had prepared this story before ever driving up here. He was looking at a man who'd done this deliberately, who'd chained 3 horses in killing weather and driven away, and who now stood in expensive shoes lying with the ease of long practice. You have papers? Marcus asked. Registration? Proof of ownership? Veterinary records showing they're yours? Drummond's smile thinned slightly. Of course. In my vehicle, I can provide whatever documentation you require. But I'm sure you understand, Mr. Chen, that possession of someone else's livestock, even with good intentions, is still technically theft. I'd hate for this situation to become legally complicated when it could be resolved simply. You return my property. I compensate you for your trouble and any expenses you've incurred, and we all move on with our lives. The casual threat wrapped in reasonable language made Marcus's skin crawl, but he kept his expression carefully blank. Horses are under veterinary care right now. One's critical, infection, and possible sepsis. They're not going anywhere until they're stable enough to travel. And when they do go somewhere, it won't be until Sheriff Graves confirms your ownership claim and investigates how they ended up chained in that storm. Drummond's facade cracked slightly, irritation bleeding through. I don't think you understand your position here. I have lawyers, Mr. Chen. Good ones. I can make your life extremely difficult if you choose to be unreasonable about this. Or, the smile returned cold and sharp. You can be smart, take the money I'm offering, and let me collect what's mine. Save yourself a lot of trouble and expense. Marcus took a step forward, closing the distance between them enough that Drummond instinctively stepped back. Let me be clear, Marcus said quietly. Those horses nearly died. They're covered in wounds from the chains you or your people put on them. They're starved and traumatized, and one of them might not survive the week despite everything we're doing. So you can take your money and your lawyers and your threats, and you can get off my property. You want those horses, you go through proper channels. You prove ownership legally, you answer questions about how they ended up abandoned, and maybe if all that checks out, we discuss what happens next. But it doesn't happen today, and it doesn't happen because you showed up here trying to intimidate me. For a long moment Drummond just stared at him, and Marcus could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, weighing options and outcomes. Finally the man smiled again, and this time there was nothing friendly about it at all. You're making a mistake, he said softly. You're a single man living alone on a failing farm, no family, no real ties to this community. People like you, Mr. Chen, they disappear into their grief and nobody notices until the bank forecloses and the property goes to auction. You really want to fight me over 3 horses that aren't even yours? Is that really the hill you want to die on? The words hit harder than they should have, mainly because they carried truth Marcus couldn't entirely deny. He was alone, was isolated, was barely holding the farm together on inherited money that wouldn't last forever. But he thought about Storm's eyes in the flashlight beam that first night, about Ember's tentative acceptance of food from his hand, about Shadow fighting through fever and infection with a stubbornness that deserved to be matched. Yeah, Marcus said. I guess it is. Drummond held his gaze for another few seconds, then turned and walked back to his SUV without another word. He moved quickly despite the snow, clearly done pretending at civility, and when he drove away he did it too fast, tires spinning and spitting slush. Marcus stood watching until the vehicle disappeared from view. His heart pounding and his hands shaking slightly with adrenaline, he hadn't allowed himself to act on. Only when the sound of the engine faded completely did he turn back to the barn, where 3 horses waited, unaware that the danger they faced had just shifted from natural to human. Storm was standing at her stall door, ears forward, as if she'd been listening to the entire exchange. Marcus went to her, resting his forehead against her neck, letting her warmth and solid presence ground him. "That was bad," he told her quietly. "That was really bad, and it's going to get worse before it gets better." Storm made a low sound, almost a rumble, and Marcus took what comfort he could from the fact that she was here, alive, healing despite everything that had been done to try to destroy her. He pulled out his phone with hands that were steadier than they'd been a moment ago and called Ben first, explaining the visit and Drummond's threats. The vet listened without interrupting, then sighed heavily. "I was afraid of this. Drummond has a reputation in the county. Not a good one. Buys horses cheap, usually from bad situations, claims he's rehabilitating them but really just breaks them with brutal methods, then sells them off. There've been complaints but nothing that stuck legally. He's got money, got connections, knows how to work the system." Ben paused. "You need to call Linda. Get this on record officially." Sheriff Linda Graves answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the gravelly tone of someone who'd been up most of the night dealing with winter accident reports. Marcus explained the situation, described Drummond's visit and the implied threats, and heard her swear softly on the other end of the line. "Victor Drummond is a piece of work," she said bluntly. "Been trying to pin something on him for years, but he's slippery. Always has explanations, always has his bases covered legally even when everyone knows he's dirty. You did the right thing not letting him take those horses, but Chun, I need to be honest with you. This is going to get messy." Linda promised to drive out later that morning to take a formal statement, to document the horse's condition with photographs and measurements, to start building a case that would hopefully prevent Drummond from simply claiming his property and walking away. But her tone wasn't optimistic, and Marcus understood why. Money and lawyers could twist situations, could make cruelty look like misunderstanding, could turn victims into inconvenient obstacles in someone's property rights. The system that should protect animals like Storm and Ember and Shadow was full of loopholes large enough to drive expensive SUVs through, and people like Drummond knew exactly where every gap existed. Maria arrived around 8. Her Jeep loaded with more supplies and her face set in an expression Marcus was learning meant she'd heard news and was preparing for battle. She climbed out with a thermos in one hand and determination radiating from every line of her body. "Tom Morrison called me," she said without preamble. "Said Drummond was in the feed store yesterday asking questions about who might have found horses during the storm. Tom played dumb, but someone else probably told him about you. Word is Drummond's been working the phone lines, talking to his lawyer, making noise about theft charges." She thrust the thermos at Marcus. "Coffee. Drink it, then tell me everything." They stood in the barn while Marcus recounted the morning's visit, Maria's expression growing darker with each detail. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring at nothing, her jaw working. "That man," she said finally, voice tight with controlled fury, "has been a cancer in this county for too long. Every few months someone reports horses missing, or finds one in bad shape, and somehow the trail always seems to lead back to Silver Creek Ranch, but nothing ever sticks. He's got state representatives in his pocket, contributes to local political campaigns, sits on boards and committees. He's untouchable because he's made himself useful to people with power." Marcus felt his stomach sink. He'd known taking on Drummond wouldn't be easy, but hearing Maria lay out the scope of what they were up against made the morning's confrontation feel like the opening salvo in a war he wasn't equipped to fight. "So what do we do?" he asked, hating the defeat that crept into his voice. Maria looked at him sharply. "We fight. We document everything, we get Ben's veterinary reports on record, we make sure Linda has everything she needs for her investigation. We don't let money and connections override what's right. And we make sure Drummond knows he's not just bullying one isolated guy anymore. He's taking on the whole community because that's what this is now." Emma arrived shortly after her mother, brought along despite Maria's obvious preference to shield her daughter from the uglier aspects of what was unfolding. The girl went immediately to Storm, who'd become her particular favorite, and began the grooming routine she'd established over the past few days. She chattered to the mare about school drama and her reading homework, her voice a bright counterpoint to the tension thrumming through the adults, and Marcus found himself grateful for her presence. Children had a way of insisting the world remain at least partially normal even when everything threatened to spiral into chaos. Ben arrived mid-morning with Linda right behind him, the sheriff's official vehicle looking stern and authoritative in the farmyard. Linda was a tall woman with iron-gray hair cut short and practical, her uniform immaculate despite the early hour and difficult roads. She'd been sheriff for 12 years, elected and re-elected because people trusted her even when they didn't always like her decisions. She greeted Marcus with a firm handshake and got immediately to business, producing a digital camera and a notebook with the efficiency of someone who documented countless scenes. They went through the barn stall by stall while Ben provided medical commentary and Linda took photographs and measurements. Storm's chain wounds were documented in detail, the raw circles of damaged tissue photographed from multiple angles, measurements taken of depth and circumference. Ember's injuries received the same thorough attention, Linda's expression growing grimmer with each notation she made. Shadow was last, and when Linda crouched beside the black horse and saw the extent of his condition, the infection still visible despite treatment, the scarring on his shoulder that spoke of old abuse, she had to pause and collect herself before continuing. "This is bad," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "This is sustained neglect bordering on torture." She took her photographs, made her notes, and when she stood her face was set in lines of professional neutrality that didn't quite hide the anger underneath. "Drummond will claim he didn't know, will say a ranch hand was responsible, will throw money at the problem until it goes away. That's his pattern. But this," she gestured to, "encompass all 3 horses. This is evidence even expensive lawyers will have trouble explaining away." They moved to Marcus's kitchen table where Linda took his formal statement, recording every detail from finding the horses to Drummond's visit that morning. Ben provided a written report on the horses' condition, medical terminology that laid out the severity of their neglect in language that couldn't be misinterpreted or softened. Maria added her own statement about community knowledge of Drummond's reputation, carefully worded to avoid anything that could be construed as slander but making clear this wasn't an isolated incident in people's minds. "Here's where we are," Linda said when all the paperwork was complete. "I've got enough to open an investigation into animal cruelty charges. The evidence is solid, the medical documentation is thorough, and your statement about how and where you found them establishes abandonment. But Drummond will fight this with everything he has. He'll claim the horses are his property, produce bills of sale, argue that any care decisions are his to make as the owner. He'll probably file a theft complaint against you, Marcus, try to put you on the defensive. And he might succeed, at least initially, in getting a court order for the horses to be returned to him pending investigation." The words settled over the table like stones, heavy and cold. Marcus thought about Storm finally starting to trust, about Ember slowly learning that humans could be safe, about Shadow fighting through infection and trauma with stubborn determination. The idea of them being forced back into Drummond's custody felt like a betrayal so profound he couldn't find words for it. "What do I do?" he asked. "How do I stop that?" Linda tapped her pen against her notebook, thinking. "You need a lawyer, someone who knows animal law and property rights. You need to file for emergency custody based on the horse's medical condition. Argue they can't be moved without endangering their health. Ben's veterinary assessment will be crucial there, especially regarding Shadow. And you need to prepare for this to get expensive and ugly, because Drummond doesn't lose gracefully and he's got resources you don't." Maria was already pulling out her phone. "Julie Webb's son practices law in Kalispell, specializes in agricultural disputes. Let me call her, see if he'll take this on. Marcus, you're not alone in this. The community has resources too, and we're not letting Drummond railroad you." She stepped away to make the call, her voice dropping to urgent Spanish that Marcus couldn't follow, but whose tone conveyed the seriousness of the situation. Ben refilled his coffee cup, looking at Marcus over the rim. "Shadow's condition works in your favor legally, if that's any consolation. He genuinely cannot be moved right now without significant risk to his life. Any court would have to acknowledge that. Storm and Ember are more complicated. They're stable enough that a judge might rule they should be returned during the investigation, but with the documentation I've provided about ongoing treatment needs, we might be able to argue against it." Emma had been quiet through all of this, sitting in the corner of the kitchen with her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate Maria had made her, listening to adult conversations about lawyers and courts and fighting people with power. Now she spoke up, her voice small but determined. What if we tell everyone? Like, everyone, on the internet and news and stuff. Show them pictures of what Storm and Ember and Shadow looked like when you found them. Show people what Mr. Drummond did. Wouldn't that make it harder for him to pretend he didn't do anything wrong? The adults exchanged glances. Linda looked uncomfortable. That's a complicated suggestion. Public pressure can be effective, but it can also backfire, can taint potential jury pools if this goes to trial, can give Drummond grounds to claim he can't get a fair hearing. But, she admitted slowly, it's also true that sunlight is the best disinfectant. If people know what's happening, know what those horses looked like when Marcus found them, it becomes harder for Drummond to control the narrative. Maria returned from her phone call with cautiously good news. David Webb will take the case. He can't promise anything, but he's willing to file for emergency custody today, expedite a given Shadow's medical situation. He wants all the documentation we have, photographs, veterinary reports, everything. And he suggested we reach out to the state animal welfare organization, get them involved officially. This isn't just a local property dispute anymore. This is a pattern of abuse that needs to be addressed at a higher level. The day devolved into a flurry of activity, documents being scanned and emailed, phone calls being made to organizations and officials, a network of people being activated who cared about animal welfare and who were willing to stand against someone like Drummond. Tom Morrison stopped by with news that he'd contacted the regional newspaper, whose editor had been looking for an excuse to investigate Silver Creek Ranch for months. Pastor Julie arrived with food and the names of 3 other people who'd allegedly lost horses in suspicious circumstances that somehow connected back to Drummond. Claire came with medical supplies and offered to help with Shadow's care overnight so Marcus could sleep. By evening the barn had become something like a war room, people coming and going with information and resources, Maria coordinating everything with the efficiency of a general marshalling troops. Marcus found himself in the strange position of being simultaneously grateful for the help and overwhelmed by how quickly his private act of rescue had become a community cause. He'd wanted to save 3 horses. Instead, he'd somehow become the focal point of a fight against a powerful man whose cruelty had apparently been an open secret for years. He stepped outside as twilight settled over the valley, needing space and quiet to process everything. The sky was clear for the first time in days, stars beginning to emerge in the deep blue overhead. The temperature was dropping fast, breath clouding in front of him, and Marcus pulled his coat tighter as he walked to the barn. Inside, Storm and Ember were eating hay, their movements peaceful and unhurried. Shadow was lying down, but his head was up, his eyes tracking Marcus's entry with awareness that was sharper than it had been that morning. Marcus sat on the floor of Shadow's stall, back against the wall, letting exhaustion and stress drain away in the simple presence of breathing creatures who asked nothing of him beyond care and consistency. Shadow watched him for a long moment, then slowly, carefully, stretched his neck until his nose was inches from Marcus's hand. It was the first time the black horse had voluntarily moved toward human contact, and Marcus held perfectly still, barely breathing, letting Shadow make this choice entirely on his own terms. The horse's breath was warm against his palm, exploring, testing. Then Shadow's nose touched his hand, a contact so light Marcus almost thought he'd imagined it. But it came again, more firmly, and Marcus felt something crack open in his chest that had been frozen solid since the night his family died. Tears came without warning, silent and hot, running down his face to drip onto the barn floor. Shadow didn't pull away, didn't startle at the salt smell or the quiet sounds of a man breaking open. He just stood there, nose resting against Marcus's palm, offering the wordless comfort of presence, while Marcus finally allowed himself to fully grieve everything he'd lost, and everything he might still lose if Drummond succeeded in taking these horses back. Emma found him there 20 minutes later, still sitting on the floor with tears drying on his face and Shadow's head lowered near his hand. She didn't ask what was wrong, didn't try to fix anything. She just sat down beside him, small and warm against his side, and together they kept watch over a black horse who'd decided that maybe, just maybe, trusting humans was worth the risk of being hurt again. Maria appeared in the doorway eventually, taking in the scene, and Marcus saw her eyes go bright before she blinked it away. "David filed the emergency custody petition," she said softly. "Judge will hear it tomorrow morning. Linda got approval to post a deputy at the end of your drive tonight, just as a precaution. And half the town apparently knows what's happening now. Tom made sure of that. You're not fighting this alone, Marcus. None of us are letting Drummond win this one." Her voice carried steel underneath the gentleness, determination that had been forged through years of running a business and raising children and navigating a world that didn't always play fair. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice, and felt Emma's small hand slip into his. They sat like that in the quiet barn until full darkness had fallen and the stars were brilliant overhead. 3 humans and 3 horses bound together by choices made and battles yet to come. When they finally stood to do the evening rounds, to check IVs and change bandages and ensure everyone had food and water for the night, Marcus felt steadier than he had since Drummond's SUV had appeared in his drive. The fight ahead would be hard, potentially devastating if they lost. But tonight he had help, had community, had proof that showing up and refusing to look away could build something stronger than isolation had ever been. He walked Maria and Emma to their Jeep, watching their taillights disappear before turning back to his farmhouse. A sheriff's deputy in a patrol car was parked at the road, visible through the trees, a reminder that threats could wear expensive coats and speak in smooth voices. But inside the barn 3 horses were healing, were learning to trust again, were proving every hour that survival was possible even after cruelty had tried its best to destroy everything good. Marcus made one final check before heading inside, and when Shadow lifted his head at his approach, eyes clear and aware in the lantern light, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years settle into his bones. Not hope exactly, not yet, but its precursor, the stubborn refusal to surrender that makes hope possible. Tomorrow would bring courtrooms and lawyers and the machinery of justice that moved too slowly and broke too easily. But tonight he'd kept 3 hearts beating that would have stopped in the snow if he'd driven past. And that, Marcus told himself firmly, had to count for something. The courtroom in Kalispell was smaller than Marcus had imagined, paneled in dark with that absorbed light and made everything feel heavier. He sat beside David Webb at a table that smelled of furniture polish and old paper, his hands clenched together to keep them from shaking. Behind him, the gallery held more people than he'd expected. Maria and Emma, Tom Morrison, Pastor Julie, Claire Zhang, and at least a dozen others from Iron Ridge who'd driven through morning snow to bear witness. Across the aisle, Victor Drummond sat with 2 lawyers in suits that probably cost more than Marcus's entire wardrobe. Drummond looked relaxed, confident, occasionally leaning to whisper something to his legal team. He'd glanced at Marcus once when entering the courtroom, his expression carrying a dismissiveness that said he'd already won and this was just theater before the inevitable conclusion. Judge Catherine Morrison entered with the efficiency of someone who'd presided over hundreds of these hearings. She was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness that both sides seemed to respect. David stood when prompted, laying out their case with measured precision. He presented Ben's veterinary reports, photographs of the horses as Marcus had found them, documentation of the chains and padlocks, medical evidence of neglect spanning weeks or months. He emphasized Shadow's critical condition, arguing that moving any of the horses would endanger lives that were finally beginning to stabilize. Drummond's attorney countered with exactly the arguments Linda had predicted. His client was a respected rancher whose livestock had been stolen during a natural disaster. He produced bills of sale showing Drummond had purchased all 3 horses legitimately. He suggested the injuries were sustained during the storm when the horses broke free, that any perceived neglect was simply the result of animals being lost in harsh conditions. He characterized Marcus as well-intentioned but misguided. When both sides had presented their arguments, Judge Morrison called for a recess. Emma slipped forward from the gallery to sit beside Marcus, her small hand finding his. She didn't say anything, just sat there offering presence, and Marcus found himself grateful beyond words. When the judge returned, her expression was unreadable. She settled into her chair and looked directly at Marcus before speaking. This court recognizes the complicated nature of this case. On one hand, we have clear documentation of ownership. On the other hand, we have compelling evidence of neglect and abuse that occurred while these animals were in Mr. Drummond's care. She paused, flipping through papers. What troubles this court most significantly is the condition in which these horses were found. Chained and padlocked during a blizzard is not an accident. It suggests deliberate action, and the medical evidence of prolonged neglect indicates this was not an isolated incident. I've reviewed Dr. Foster's veterinary reports. His assessment is that the black gelding cannot be moved without significant risk to his life. The other two horses are still undergoing treatment for infected wounds and trauma. Judge Morrison's voice took on a harder edge. This court is granting temporary emergency custody of all three horses to Mr. Chen pending the outcome of the sheriff's investigation into animal cruelty charges. The animals will remain at Mr. Chen's property, where they are receiving appropriate veterinary care. Mr. Drummond, you will cooperate fully with Sheriff Graves' investigation. If you are convicted of animal cruelty or neglect, you will forfeit all ownership rights. This hearing is adjourned. Marcus sat stunned, not quite believing what had just happened. David was gathering papers with barely suppressed satisfaction. Maria was hugging Emma, and behind them the Iron Ridge contingent was celebrating with restrained enthusiasm. Drummond stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger, and for a moment Marcus thought the man might confront him directly. But his lawyer steered him toward the exit with one last look at Marcus that promised this wasn't over. Spring came to Iron Ridge with slow persistence. Snow retreated in patches, revealing brown grass that would green given time. Clearwater Creek began to thaw, its voice returning to the valley. The barn that had been a desperate shelter against winter's cruelty became something else entirely. A place of healing and transformation, where three horses learned that safety could be real and humans could be trusted. Storm greeted each morning with calm confidence, allowing Emma to groom her for hours. She'd started nickering when people approached, a sound of welcome rather than fear. Ember took longer but eventually followed Storm's lead. The chestnut remained reactive, still prone to startling, but the panic had eased into something manageable. He'd formed a particular attachment to Shadow, the two horses often standing together in comfortable silence. Shadow's transformation was the most profound. The black horse who'd been barely alive had fought his way back to something approaching wholeness. His wounds healed slowly, leaving white scars that would never disappear but no longer caused pain. His weight increased as appetite returned, ribs becoming less prominent. But more than the physical healing, there was something in Shadow's eyes that hadn't been there before. Awareness, curiosity, the faint suggestion that maybe the world held possibilities beyond suffering. The criminal charges against Drummond were filed in late March. The trial was set for summer, and in the interim the horses remained in Marcus's custody by court order. Marcus used the calm to focus on what came next, reaching out to the community for help in creating a permanent sanctuary. Tom Morrison offered materials for fence improvements. Ben said he'd provide veterinary care at cost. Pastor Julie suggested applying for grants from animal welfare organizations. Maria declared she'd organize fundraising. By summer's end, the deal was struck. Drummond relinquished all ownership rights in exchange for reduced charges. The horses were legally Marcus's, and with the community's help, the old Riverside farm had been transformed into a proper sanctuary. Storm, Ember, and Shadow would live out their lives here, in the place where they'd been saved. Marcus stood at the paddock fence one evening, watching all three horses graze in the golden light of sunset. Emma appeared beside him, slipping her hand into his. They watched in comfortable silence as Storm lifted her head, Ember tossed his mane, and Shadow, strong and whole, walked toward them with trust in his eyes. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.